Ben Shapiro is joining us now. Shalom, Ben.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
We'll be talking about the new important musical you created with your father. But first and foremost, let's discuss current events. We're recording this interview as the reports are coming in regarding the hostage deal. One thing is sure, this deal is a result of pressure coming from the Trump team.
I mean, I think the fact is that the Trump administration wants the hostages out, and I also think that they want a headline that is connected to the hostages being released. I think whether the deal ends up being a net benefit for Israel and for the United States, or whether it ends up being a net detriment, is going to be largely determined by whether it's seen as a ceasefire end of war deal or whether it's seen as a hostage release deal. And it seems to me far-fetched to believe that the Trump administration would cram down a full-scale ceasefire deal that allowed Hamas to remain in place, given the fact that literally every cabinet nominee who's spoken on this has said precisely the reverse. Just yesterday, Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense nominee, said that he supports Israel in killing literally every member of Hamas. The National Security Advisor nominee, Mike Walls, has said that Hamas will not remain in control of the Gaza Strip. So any sort of deal that ends with Hamas in control, either titular or effectual, of the Gaza Strip seems to be a non-starter. And so what that actually means is that this is probably best to be seen, if you were going to try and game it out, as a way of guaranteeing that many of the hostages get out, hopefully as many as possible, and then a recognition that Israel is going to have to go back in and mop up the job. Now, again, it's very difficult to sort of articulate that publicly in the middle of a deal that theoretically could turn into a longer-term deal, because, again, it's phased. But I think that the sort of take that this is an end of war deal as opposed to a free the hostages and then see where you are deal, I think that's probably mistaken.
So you believe that Trump's threats against Hamas are still relevant, his support in the goal of the war to destroy the terror organization?
I take President Trump at his word on that. I think that the notion that Hamas is a trustworthy negotiating partner because they decide that they're going to release babies in exchange for murderous terrorists, I don't think President Trump believes that. I don't think anyone in his national security team believes that. And so I think that probably what this is from the Trump team, as probably well as the Biden team, is get as many hostages out as you can get out with the minimum possible immediate sort of withdrawals. Most of the withdrawals that I've seen, at least the kind of framework that I'm seeing, says that the Israeli withdrawals from Netzarim or from the Philadelphia corridor are going to happen over the course of the next 7 weeks or so, 6-7 weeks. Whether we even reach that point, I think is up for debate and is going to be very much up to the IDF. I mean, I think that if I were going to try and game out the sort of math here on behalf of the IDF, the real question would be guaranteed freed hostages in exchange for a more difficult road for the IDF when they have to go back in, given the abandonment of Netzarim, given the fact that any Qatari Egyptian force is not going to be trustworthy in, for example, policing the Netzarim corridor and preventing terrorists from moving from south to north. It's a painful deal. It's, of course, going to be a painful deal. The question is how much pain, and I think that's yet to be seen.
Because here in Israel, in the right, many are blaming Trump for a deal which they define as catastrophic. People are very concerned.
Now, again, I understand many of the concerns given the nature of the deal. I think that it's only going to be determined how bad or good the deal is as it's implemented. I have enough trust in both the Netanyahu administration and the Trump administration to believe that this isn't a full-scale surrender as it's being portrayed by some.
Now, on January 20th, Trump is returning to the White House. Is this really a historic day for Israel? What's the meaning for us here?
I think the meaning for Israel is that the boot is going to be off the neck of the IDF and of Israel in general with regard to fighting terrorism and taking measures necessary to secure itself. That obviously wasn't the case with the Biden administration. That was slow-walking aid that was preventing Israel from getting weaponry that it required. It's hard to tell at this point exactly what this looks like in terms of Iran policy. If I had to ballpark it, my suggestion would be that the Americans are going to be quite friendly toward Israel protecting itself. You're not going to have as much yelling and screaming about Israel doing the things that are necessary in order to protect itself. But as I've been saying for a very long time, American interests and Israeli interests are not identical, nor should they be. They're separate countries with separate interests. And the Israelis should use this as an opportunity to make themselves more independent of the entire world, including the United States, with regard to, for example, arms supply and foreign policy. Yeah, I think there's a tendency sometimes when I talk to my Israeli friends to think that whatever the American administration is, it's the job of the Israelis to sort of mirror that position. And so the kind of future of the state of Israel ought to be made dependent on whomever is in the White House. That seems to me bad policy by any state, including Israel. And I think that if Israel is hoping that President Trump is going to sort of do the work for Israel, I don't think that's what he was elected to do, nor do I think that that's what anyone should expect President Trump to do. I mean, what they're going to get is an administration that is very friendly toward Israel, that wants to see Israel protect itself, that recognizes that Israel's enemies are indeed evil and seek its destruction, and is going to act that way. But again, no one can predict the future, and no one even knows who's going to be president 5 years from now. So I would always urge Israel and the United States to, again, act as states that are independent in their own interests.
Now, when you hear those defining this term as an opportunity to promote sovereignty in Judea and Samaria, you say, hold your horses?
I don't know. I mean, that's an actual policy ramification. I think that depends. It depends on what President Trump thinks, what his security team thinks. I can assume that the Trump team will be significantly more friendly toward that position, given the fact that Mike Huckabee, the ambassador to Israel from the United States, is very much pro-annexation of Judea and Samaria, and so are many other members of Trump's cabinet. I mean, it could be said that there are more members of Trump's cabinet who are pro-annexation than members of the Israeli cabinet who are pro-annexation at this point. But I think that whether that materializes or not, that's up in the air. I think that the way that most foreign nations think of the United States, they think that the U.S. is spending enormous amounts of time and effort thinking about foreign nations, and that's not the way that it works over here.
Now let's talk about your musical, We Will Rise, which you created with your father. You're a man of words, but this is a completely different ballgame. Tell us, please, about the process.
Well, it really is via my father. So I was a musician growing up. I started playing violin at the age of 5. I was at one point a fairly world-class violinist when I was in my teenage years. My father had written music for film and TV and had always wanted to write for musical theater. And so he and I combined on this project. He wrote the music and the lyrics. I wrote the libretto, which is say the plot and the dialogue. And when we put this together originally, we put it together in, I believe, 2021 is when we started working on this. And it was a musical about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which is what We Will Rise is about. And we basically completed what we thought was a good round of that going into 2023. And then October 7th happened. And we really wanted to tie the messages that were very relevant from the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising to October 7th, to the modern day state of Israel. And so the musical now opens with 2 soldiers from the IDF going into Kfar Aza and finding it burned out and realizing that one of the soldiers' grandmothers has been kidnapped into Gaza. And they find on the floor of her home a picture of a baby and her parents from the Warsaw Ghetto. We flash into the picture, and now we tell the story of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. I think that it is a musical about Jewish unity in the face of annihilationist enemies. It's a musical about the fact that no matter how much Jews may try to escape anti-Semitism will always come for them. And it's a movie about why, and it's a musical about why the state of Israel is necessary to collective self-defense. The answer to never again for the Jews was not just relying on the kindness of other nations, which of course Jews all over the world are still reliant on that, but also the establishment of the state of Israel as a homeland and protector for Jews everywhere. And so that's what the musical is really about in essence. And I think that message was relevant before October 7th. I think it's even more relevant after October 7th.
Yeah, because when you started working on it, it was relevant to some extent, but today it's the story of our lives.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think one of the things that we were thinking about when we wrote it originally was all of the hubbub that was happening in Israel over judicial reform. And from afar, if you're living in Israel, this is all very immediate. From afar, from 30,000-foot view from America, you see Israelis who are talking about civil war, and you're thinking to yourself, this is insane. What are you even talking about? You're talking about the administration of the judiciary in fairly technical regulatory terms. I understand there are a lot of deeper issues that are connected with the legislation that are really serious for a lot of people. But that sort of language is dangerous. It invites violence. It invites conflict from external sources. And that's sort of the story of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. It's people who are thrust together by fate and forced together by circumstance who have to come together to fight an extraneous evil. And that, to me, has always been the story of the state of Israel. It's also the story as a religious Jew. It's the story of Jewish history as well. It's indeed the story of Jewish history. And that brings me to the next question. Is there really anything we can do? As our sages say, Esav soneh Yaakov, they will always hate us. Is there anything that can really be done to change the situation, to battle anti-Semitism? I mean, again, I don't think it's really about fighting anti-Semitism. To me, is less about changing anti-Semites into neutrals or friendlies than it is about standing virtuously for virtuous values. And if you do that, whatever happens is what happens. You can't control how other people feel or what other people do. Anti-Semitism is a conspiracy theory that flourishes in a wide variety of climates, and the attempt to sort of fight it by playing whack-a-mole, I think is probably doomed to failure. The only thing that you can do, and this is true when you face any adversity in life, whether it's a systemic adversity like racism or anti-Semitism, or whether it's just true in your daily life, the only thing that you can do is focus on your own success. And I think all attempts to sort of please the people who hate you are not only doomed to failure, they're wildly counterproductive.
So the musical came to Israel. We'll be back soon.
Sure. So we wrote it in English. It was translated into Hebrew. It played 9 times in Israel, a couple times in Yerushalayim. It played in Beersheba. It played in Bet Shemesh. It played in Herzliya, in Ariel. We were hoping to bring it back for another round around Yom Zikaron, around Yom HaTzmaut and Yom HaShoah, because, of course, it's relevant to all of those days. And we're hoping to make it sort of a seasonal feature of the Israeli calendar. And then, of course, we're hoping to bring it in English to the United States. We're putting together sort of the operational plan in the United States right now, because we think that it's relevant not only to Israeli Jews, but to Jews abroad, Jews who are living not in Israel, as well as non-Jews who are living outside Israel.
And you, Ben, you visited Israel recently. Tell us about being here during these days. You know, you're involved very much. You're familiar with the details and the stories, but it's totally different when you come to visit, right?
Well, it's certainly different, mainly because the Israelis are an astonishing people. I mean, as a country, you have the only above replacement level fertility rate in the West, living in perhaps the worst region on planet Earth, facing existential threat on a constant basis. And that's an amazing, amazing thing. And when you meet 18-year-old Israelis, they're very different from 18-year-old Americans. 18-year-old Americans are still trying to decide their gender. 18-year-old Israelis are serving in the military. It's a very different thing. And when we came last time, I came with my wife and with my family as well, and we were visiting with wounded soldiers at Sheba Hospital, or when we were talking with people who are serving. One of the things that I did last time I was there is we did an event with Douglas Murray in Jerusalem. And one of the things that I did is I asked people who are in the hall, because in the United States, a very small percentage of Americans actually serve in the military, which means not a lot of Americans actually even know somebody who is currently serving in the military. And I said I think the world to see this. I asked people who are currently serving in the IDF, who had served in the Gaza war, to stand up. And of course, there's a quarter of the audience. And then I said, immediate family members of anybody who's serving the war, and the entire audience stands up. It's a completely different thing. And the thing that I always come to whenever I visit Israel is that Israelis seem to have been failed by the political system. The Israeli people are astonishing. They're unified on, I think, the biggest questions in Israeli life, but the political system is extraordinarily unwieldy, incredibly fractious. And that means that despite the fact that there's probably 70% unity, I've said this before, I think there's probably 70% unity on the 3 biggest questions in Israel, which would be everyone should serve in the military, Israel needs to be more independent in terms of its foreign policy and weapons production, and Israel needs to radically deregulate its economy. All 3 propositions seem to me 70, 80% propositions in Israel, and yet there's no workable coalition that offers all 3. That is a failure of the political system, but that's not a failure of the Israeli people.
Ben Shapiro, you sound very optimistic today.
I mean, I'm very optimistic, a lot more optimistic than I was 1 year ago, for certain. I'm optimistic for America because I think that President Trump is going to be an extraordinarily effective president. I think that the cabinet that he's appointing right now is filled with tremendous people with a lot of the right values. And I think that he is going to be pursuing a metric of success for the country that's going to be awesome. And when I look at Israel, I'm very optimistic as well. Israel is in a strong security position in its north. It's in a strong security position with regard to Syria. It's in a strong security position even with regard to the Gaza Strip in terms of being able to make the Strip significantly more quiescent. And of course, they're in a strong position with regard to Iran. There will always be new and looming threats in the Middle East. I think the Israeli people are unified and ready to face that down.
Okay, Ben Shapiro, thank you very much for joining us.
I appreciate it. Thank you.